Hello again. In this podcast, I'm continuing my reading from the book What is Man? Adam, Alien, or Ape? In the previous podcast, in this particular series, we were looking at chapter 9 of that book, which relates to the human consciousness and the relationship between the human mind and the human brain. And we introduced an analogy at that time, which was intended to help us understand these rather complex relationships. The analogy involved imagining that you live in a house, but it's not a house built of bricks and mortar. It's a house which represents your brain. You are the occupant, and that occupant represents your mind. And the distinction between mind and brain is extremely important, because it is a distinction that many neuroscientists deny. The garden of the house represents your body, your physical body, and in the basement of the house there are machines which look after the functioning of the body without you being conscious of it. Now, I then amplified the analogy to pretend that you had a number of realtors or estate agents come to value the house. And in particular, we saw there were 3 such realtors, and we have a quick look at the way they behaved and what they gave by way of an opinion of the value of the house. But now we're going to look in greater detail at the opinions of the different realtors. And the realtors represent the various theories of mind and consciousness that are on offer today. The first realtor claimed that the house was the only thing that existed, that you, as its occupant, that is the mind, do not actually exist or have no separate or independent existence. And now we're going to develop that idea and see how it stands the test of experience and reality. Realtor 1. Does your mind exist? That's a subheading. The view that only material objects are ultimately real is called materialism, though other names such as physicalism, monism, or reductionism are also used. A material object can be defined as a publicly observable object, accessible to everyone in space-time. Materialism, therefore, denies the existence of genuine non-material entities, such as mind, spirit, and soul, while treating consciousness as an illusion arising from the operation of a material organ, the brain. Materialism is based on the idea that every effect, including every human experience, must have a physical cause. John Haldane was a geneticist and religious skeptic who vigorously promoted Darwinian evolution, yet he was technically an agnostic rather than an atheist. And in our chapter heading, quote, he concludes that, quote, mind is not wholly conditioned by matter, close quote, and neatly sums up the dilemma facing those who claim that consciousness is merely a byproduct of the physical brain. His opinion ought to carry weight with all of us, whatever our beliefs. But sadly, it leaves materialists unmoved. For example, Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the DNA double helix, begins his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, in the following way, quote, the astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. This hypothesis is so alien to the ideas of most people today that it can truly be called astonishing. Close quote. Perhaps so, but the belief that mind is nothing more than a byproduct of brain activity is widely held and vigorously promoted by many neuroscientists and popular science writers today. They ignore the self-evident problem highlighted by Haldane, among others, and claim that mind has no independent existence, but is simply our awareness of the activity of our physical brains, our, quotes, pack of neurons, close quotes. For example, respected psychologists Malcolm Jeeves and Warren Brown declare, quote, we believe it is no longer helpful or reasonable to consider mind a non-material entity that can be decoupled from the body. It is a functional property of our brain and body. Close quotes. Patricia Churchland is an analytical philosopher noted for her work on the philosophy of mind. Unfortunately, she is also an aggressive anti-Christian materialist, which colors her arguments and degrades her scientific objectivity. In her popular-level book, Touching a Nerve, Our Brain, Ourselves, she explains that our brain circuitry is organized to provide neural models or maps of the outside world, adding, quotes, when I consult a road map, there is a map in my hand, and quite separately, there is me. The map in my hand and I are not one. In the case of the brain, there is just the brain. There is no separate thing, me, existing apart from my brain. No separate me that reads my brain map. Close quote. In the analogy, this is like saying that the house representing the physical brain goes about its sophisticated, automated functions but remains unoccupied. You, the owner, simply do not exist. She argues that external influences imported by the physical senses create physical maps of the external world in our physical brains, and our brains then formulate appropriate responses which issue in suitable behavior. In her materialistic scheme, no metaphysical self is needed to create the brain maps, read them, or initiate responses. No metaphysical self is needed to create the brain maps, read them, or initiate responses. She continues, quote, "The designer of brain organization is not a human cartographer, but biological evolution. If an animal's brain misrepresents its domain, mistaking a rattlesnake for a stick, the animal will probably be killed before it can reproduce." Thus, she claims, natural selection ensures that appropriate behavior is rewarded and inappropriate behavior is punished, causing brains to further evolve their capacity to make wise, that is, reproductively helpful, behavioral decisions. But do neurons, neural circuits, or any of the physical hardware of the brain have any capacity to make decisions that lead to one form of behavior rather than another, regardless of whether the decision is wise or unwise? For evolution to design the kind of system she describes, each decision would need to be random. If it were purposeful or pre-programmed, her materialistic thesis would collapse irretrievably. Granted that a decision to grab the snake could prove fatal, unless you're a mongoose, how can a random decision not to grab the snake help you next time you meet one? The only way you will avoid taking liberties with serpents in future is for you or others you observe to survive such encounters, and you learn not to risk another brush with death. In other words, a learning process is involved, and learning requires conscious activity. No doubt someone will object to this last statement, pointing out that non-conscious robots and computers can learn. For example, that expensive voice recognition software you bought for your computer had to learn the way you personally pronounced words before you could use it. Of course, computers can learn, but only if they have been programmed to do so by a conscious agent. The necessity of conscious action in learning is preserved. That's why you had to buy the expensive software. Your conscious dog quickly learned to recognize your voice, but your non-conscious computer would never have done so on its own. In using simplistic evolutionary arguments, Churchland is merely hiding behind a form of psychological behaviorism, which is defined as the belief, quotes, "The behavior can be described and explained without making ultimate reference to mental events or to internal psychological processes. The sources of behavior are external in the environment, not internal in the mind or in the head. Kirchland sidesteps any attempt to explain how brain states influence our actions and merely asserts that they do. That's fair enough, but she then smuggles in the claim that this eliminates the need for a conscious agency to be evolved, a claim that reduces all living organisms to pre-programmed robots. Most school kids these days could design a simple robot that detects an obstacle and changes course to avoid a collision. But living organisms are more than robots. Subheading: Rialto 2, the one who suggested that you are a ghost in the analogy. Your second visitor was friendlier, but hardly more reassuring. On this view, consciousness is an epiphenomenon, something arising from the activity of the physical brain, but having no independent existence, power, or significance. You do not exist as a self-conscious person, but only as a helpless emanation from the material brain. When I walk into my utility room, I often hear the gentle hum that tells me that the freezer is working. The hum comes and goes, of course, since the freezer motor only runs when the temperature rises in the cabinet. But this intermittent operation is itself an indication that all is well. Thus, the hum does have a function, but it isn't a necessary function. A soundproof freezer would work equally well. The hum has no power to influence the operation of the equipment. It can't change the cabinet temperature or alter any of its settings. It is simply a byproduct, or even a waste product, of the freezer machinery, an inessential, insignificant, incidental, and accidental emanation. In the more technical language of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, quote, Epiphenomenalism is the view that mental events are caused by physical events in the brain, but have no effect upon any physical event. And behavior is caused by muscles that contract upon receiving neural impulses, and neural impulses are generated by input from other neurons or from sense organs. On the epiphenomenalist view, mental events play no causal role in this process. Huxley, who held this view, compared mental events to a steam whistle that contributes nothing to the work of a locomotive. What I have just described is an extreme form of the popular belief that mind emerges from the physical brain, and we shall meet more moderate versions of this idea below. But either way, you will often come across the claim that mind is somehow unreal, the ghost in the machine. An article in New Scientist in August 2016 puts it thus, quote, René Descartes was convinced that the body and conscious mind are two different substances. The first is made of matter, the latter is immaterial, non-material. His ideas influenced neuroscience until a few decades ago, but the field has moved on. Today, it is widely accepted that our brains give rise to consciousness. But how? That is a raging debate. Close quotes. Descartes may be dead, but he isn't buried. At least some of his ideas survive. Philosopher Keith Ward, former Regius Professor of Divinity at Oxford University, writes, quotes, "The metaphor of a ghost in the machine has worked well as a rhetorical device to make people think that we all know that the brain, the machine, is real, whereas talk of a mind other than the brain, or of mental events in addition to brain events, is talk about something peculiar, not quite real, and probably illusory, a ghost. But talk of mental events is the most real thing we humans know. We know we have sense experiences, bodily sensations, thoughts, feelings, and images. We know we experience things in ways that are unique to us and never wholly communicable to other people. Mental events are real, and to deny them would deprive us of all knowledge. They are not ghosts or hallucinations at all." Close quotes. In the next section, we shall see that the non-material mind is far from powerless, having the capacity to modify brain activity and physical and emotional responses.